Mobotropolis, 3219.
Doctor, I think she's unconscious.
Take it easy, Rosie.
Dr. Horatio Quack replied as he turned to his obstetrics nurse, Charlotte.
Char, what do her vitals look like?
The spider, covered almost completely in surgical dress, had her 6 hands full monitoring the vital signs of the patient.
Vital signs holding steady, Doctor. That last contraction was pretty intense.
Right. Higgins?
He said as he turned to the black and white lop-eared rabbit working as nurse anaesthetist.
Make sure she's got enough oxygen.
We've got plenty.
Just then, the patient, Queen Alicia of Mobius, moaned softly and turned her head, her open head fur matted and glistening with perspiration. Charlotte wiped her patient's brow for what felt like the 100th time.
You're doing fine, Your Majesty.
Dr. Quack would have preferred to call his patient by her given name, but royal protocol demanded that so long as anyone else was in the room, he had to address members of the royal family in the formal manner. In any event, he was glad that the 2 hulking guards assigned to safeguard the Queen's person had been convinced that they could discharge their duty just as efficiently waiting outside the delivery room. He hated sightseers.
Just one more contraction, I think.
Contractions starting, Doctor.
All right, Your Majesty, push. Etta?
He called over his shoulder to the bosomy hen who worked as chief nurse in the neonatal and pediatrics unit at Mobotropolis General Hospital.
Get ready to take over.
With the efficiency of experience, the staff in the delivery room went to work. Etta positioned herself to take the infant from the doctor and clean it up as soon as it was born. Rosie, a woodchuck designated to be the child's nursemaid and nanny, stood by as well. Dr. Quack gently pressed on the Queen's abdomen as she pushed with what little strength she had left.
Okay, here's the head that's next to where the crown. Shoulders are in position and...
He paused as the birthing process was completed, letting nature take its course.
And, Your Majesty, you have a prince.
Etta took the infant from Dr. Quack and deftly drained any remaining fluid from the baby's airway. Then, even before she began to clean him up, she held him aloft for Queen Alicia to see. The hardy-looking infant, his eyes still closed tight, coughed once, then began crying lustily. As exhausted as she was, Queen Alicia broke into a broad and beautiful smile.
Doctor?
Charlotte called out urgently.
Is there something wrong?
I'm still getting a fetal heartbeat.
For 2 seconds, there was no movement in the delivery room, and no sound other than the crying of the newborn prince. Dr. Quack quickly looked at the instrument panel to Charlotte's side, then put on his stethoscope and placed it on the Queen's abdomen.
Somebody tell me this is some kind of joke.
Dr. Quack said, half out loud.
Char, let me have an ultrascan.
Charlotte pressed several buttons, and a grainy grey image appeared on a nearby monitor.
How does it look?
Queen Alicia managed to whisper.
Not good. Etta, get that baby into the nursery, then call down to neonatal intensive care and tell them we need an isolate warmed up and in here stat. Everybody else, back to your places. It's a whole new ballgame. Char, let me see the previous ultrascan.
Charlotte brought up another image.
I can't even see the other baby.
I know. Prince was one big baby. He took up almost the whole image.
Didn't you know the Queen was carrying twins?
How could I?
Dr. Quack said, with more than a hint of exasperation.
I was only able to examine the Queen twice when she was pregnant, and even then I had to make house calls to the palace. All I had with me were the instruments in my bag. I didn't have the equipment that would have spotted it.
Whose idea was that?
Higgins asked.
I don't know, some bureaucrat in the War Ministry. Somebody was afraid that if I was seen coming and going from the castle too many times that the overlanders might get wind of it and use it for propaganda purposes. So I was never able to give the Queen the kind of prenatal care that would have caught this. Security considerations, my feathered...
Another contraction starting, Doctor.
Sorry, Your Majesty, we're not done yet. Give us one more push.
Confused and frightened, the Queen used the last ounce of her strength to deliver her second child. She lay back on the bed, exhausted. Almost immediately, though, her eyes opened wide.
I don't hear anything. There's no crying. Why isn't there any crying?
Dr. Quack seemed not to hear as he worked to clean up the infant girl the Queen had just delivered. He had hoped against hope that the ultrascan was wrong, but it had been painfully accurate. Unlike Queen Alicia's firstborn, this child's arms and legs were uncomfortably thin. Her entire body, in fact, looked as if it could never support the weight of her head. And instead of a cry, the only sound she made was a series of rapid, high-pitched grunts as she struggled for breath.
She's too weak to cry,
Dr. Quack said, half aloud, before yelling at the top of his voice.
Where's that isolate?
At once, the door to the delivery room banged open as Etta wheeled a large cart into the room. On the top, beneath a clear dome, was a blanket that gave off an even warmth. Dr. Quack gently placed the baby girl on the blanket before lowering the dome.
Etta, help me get her to the elevator, then call down to an ICU. Tell them we're bringing down an LBW with a possible RDS. We'll need to get a line in to monitor her blood gases, and she'll have to be put on a CPAP. Shar, take over here.
He and Etta then began to wheel the cart out of the delivery room. Dr. Quack, however, paused at the door and turned to look at the Queen, whose eyes were beginning to fill with tears.
I'm sorry, Alicia,
he said, as gently as he could. Let someone else worry about protocol. An hour later, Dr. Quack was ushered into the royal suite on the top floor of the hospital. The entire floor had been cleared to accommodate the King and Queen for what should have been a routine delivery. In the room, Queen Alicia sat up in bed, looking to her left where her firstborn, Prince Elias, lay sound asleep in a hospital crib after having been cleaned and dressed and nursed by his mother. It was all part of the bonding process, Dr. Quack knew, but from the look on Alicia's face, he knew that her thoughts were also with her other child. The doctor bowed as protocol demanded, then the King dismissed his guards and Rosie, and they left the room.
Don't leave anything out, old friend,
King Max said, as calmly as he could.
All right, the princess?
Sally.
Queen Alicia spoke up.
Princess Sally was born with a low birth weight.
You mean she's premature?
The King asked.
No, low birth weight can happen even in full-term infants. Max tells me you've been taking care of yourself, so my guess is that she was, well, crowded out by her twin brother while she was in the womb. Basically, she was what they used to refer to as a runt of the litter.
Was there anything you could have done?
Had I known the Queen was carrying twins earlier, I could have monitored the situation more closely, thanks to those boneheads in the War Ministry.
That's enough, Horatio,
the King said, with a touch of sternness. No use compounding a bad situation with talk that technically qualified as treason.
What's her condition?
She has RDS, respiratory distress syndrome. It's common in low birth weight infants and premature babies. Her lungs weren't quite ready to start working on their own, so now she's fighting for every breath she takes.
What are you doing for her?
The Queen asked.
We fitted her for a CPAP. That's a continuous positive airway pressure device to make her breathing easier. We're also monitoring the amount of oxygen in her blood and supplementing it as needed, and watching her so that she doesn't go into shock.
What are her chances?
RDS is what we call self-limiting, which means that the best that we can do is cooperate with nature in letting the condition resolve itself. It usually happens within 3 to 5 days.
And what if it doesn't resolve itself, whatever that means?
The King asked testily.
What kind of a life will she have then?
Max, if the condition doesn't resolve itself by day 5, there won't be a day 6.
He had said it. He had spoken of that which had been weighing heavily on the hearts of the royal couple, but about which they had dared not speak. He approached the Queen's bed and took her by the hand.
We're doing all we can for her, Alicia, but there's only so much we can do. The fact is, this is Sally's fight now.
The vehicle made its way through the blacked-out streets of Mobotropolis in the pre-dawn stillness. Its passenger, Dr. Quack, rubbed the sleep from his eyes. After having spoken to the king and queen about the condition of their daughter, he had been told that he should go home and get some sleep. Yet it was no more than 2 hours later that he received a call from Rosie to return to the hospital. He dressed quickly and arrived in a matter of minutes. He found Rosie pacing in the deserted front lobby of the hospital.
"Where's the king?"
he asked. He spoke softly, but his voice still echoed across the tile and marble foyer.
Probably in his room, and I don't care if I never see him again.
What happened?
Earlier this evening, I accompanied him to the intensive care to look at his daughter. We saw the poor little thing lying there, fighting for her life. And you know what he said? She's no bigger than a bean. Then he turns and walks away. Can you believe the heartless?
I wouldn't be too hard on him, Rosie.
He replied as he rubbed his face with his hand.
Most new parents, unless they've spent a lot of time around babies, only have a vague notion of what a newborn looks like. And usually they err on the side of cuteness. Unless they're prepared for it, the sight of a preemie or an LBW can be a real shock, like looking at something from another planet. I'm sure Max was just stunned and said the first thing that came to his head, no matter how stupid it was.
Well, I do hope you're right, Doctor. But it's the Queen I called you about.
How long has she been here?
Going on 2 hours now, and nobody can persuade her to move. She just won't budge.
Okay, I'll talk to her.
Dr. Quack walked the silent corridors until he reached the hallway just outside the NICU. There was a large window to permit people to see inside, and before that window stood Queen Alicia. She wore a floor-length blue robe, belted at the waist, yet she also clutched at the collar with her left hand, not so much to stay warm, but just to have something, anything, to hold on to. Her other hand rested on the glass, as if she could somehow communicate with the one on the other side if she just left it there long enough. In an incubator unit, under a heating lamp, lay Princess Sally. Frail and naked, her chest rose and fell once every second. A knit cap was pulled down over her eyes to block out the light above her. A tube that seemed to be bigger around than her arm was connected to a giant-looking needle plunged beneath the skin of one forearm. A clear plastic mask was held in place over her nose and mouth by an elastic strap. Too weak even to nurse, she was being fed by an IV tube attached by another needle to her ankle.
Your Majesty?
He said gently. She seemed not to have heard him. Then she turned to him, and he could see quite clearly the streaks on her face where she'd been crying quietly.
I don't want her to die.
Let's go,
Dr. Quack said gently as he placed a hand on her shoulder.
There's nothing you can do anyway.
And with that, he gently guided her away from the NICU and toward the elevator. Mobotropolis, 3235. The vehicle made its way through the empty streets of Mobotropolis in the pre-dawn stillness. Its passenger, Dr. Quack, rubbed the sleep from his eyes. The past few days had been an emotional nightmare. At first, all anyone could talk of was the fact that Prince Elias, long thought to have been a casualty of the Great War, was rumoured to be alive. his return to Mobotropolis, so recently liberated from the iron rule of Ivo Robotnik, was seen as the best possible news of all. But that euphoria was tempered all too quickly by the news that Queen Alicia had also survived the crash of their vehicle, but just barely. For over 15 years she had been kept in a stasis chamber by, well, nobody knew exactly who had saved the Queen's life. Not even Prince Elias, who seemed not to hear any questions asked him about how he had survived. Dr. Quack smiled wryly. Prince Elias was only a baby when he and Queen Alicia had been evacuated from the city.
For all the good that did them,
he thought. Still, it was a demonstration of just how the universe orders things that it had been decided that Princess Sally, who managed to survive the crisis of her first few days of life, was too frail to make the journey. So it was that Sally stayed with her father, whose nickname for her of Bean actually became a sign of his deep affection for her. As she grew older, she preferred to dress in outfits with billowy sleeves, the better to disguise her too thin arms and legs. She was turning into a fine young girl, with perhaps a little too serious of an outlook about life at court for someone her age. But all that changed when War Minister Julian had betrayed King and Kingdom by becoming Dr. Robotnik. And yet, the same Sally, who had escaped from Robotnik with a handful of other children, had become just what Dr. Quack had seen her to be as she lay in her isolette. She had become a fighter, and she and the children she had grown up with, particularly a brash young hedgehog named Sonic, had gotten the best of Robotnik against all odds. But that was the past now. Max was back on the throne, and the royal family had been reunited under less than ideal circumstances. The stasis chamber containing the Queen's dormant form was placed in one of the cold rooms below the main level of the palace, while Dr. Quack prepared to run diagnostic tests on the Queen. He wasn't hopeful. After having spoken to the King, Sally, and Elias about the condition of the Queen, he had been told that he could go home and get some sleep. Yet it was no more than 2 hours later that he received a call from Rosie to return to the palace. He dressed quickly and arrived in a matter of minutes. He found Rosie pacing in the deserted front hallway.
How long has she been there?
Going on 2 hours now, and nobody can persuade her to move. She just won't budge.
Okay. I'll talk to her.
Dr. Quack walked the silent corridors until he reached the stairway leading to the lower level. Outside the cold room was a changing room where he slipped into winter clothing. Then he went inside. Only a few lights were turned on in the chamber, making it seem larger and more eerie than it was even when fully lit. On a platform in the center of the room rested the stasis unit. It was little more than a glass tube filled with liquid in which Queen Alicia floated, fetus-like, with no sign that she was conscious of her surroundings. Dr. Quack didn't like stasis medicine. Of course, he was grateful for the technology that afforded patients a bit more life and bought their physicians a bit more time. Still, he couldn't help but remember the comment a professor of his at the Mobian Academy of Medical Arts had made about stasis chambers.
It's a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there.
Stasis medicine wasn't healing. It was, at best, a stopgap measure. Next to the tube stood Princess Sally. She was all of 16 years old now, on the verge of womanhood. It never ceased to amaze Dr. Quack how much of Alicia he saw in Sally, especially her auburn hair and her clear blue eyes. She wore the same winter clothing as he had on, zipped to her chin. Yet she clutched at the collar with her left hand, not so much to stay warm, but just to have something, anything, to hold on to. Her other hand rested on the glass, as if she could somehow communicate with the one on the other side if she just left it there long enough.
Your Majesty?
She seemed not to have heard him. Then she turned to him, and he could see quite clearly the streaks on her face where she'd been crying quietly.
I don't want her to die.
Let's go.
Dr. Quack said gently as he placed a hand on her shoulder.
There's nothing you can do anyway.
And with that, he gently guided her away from the stasis chamber and back towards the changing room. In the overhead light, he caught a glint of something. Sally's signet ring. On its blue stone was etched in gold the cosmic serpent. It was the symbol of life as well as of Mobius, of its eternal endurance. Yet it also symbolized the unpredictable, quirky nature of life, which refused to form a neat and rational circle, just as the serpent formed a figure that twisted back upon itself.
Kurami tirahtalie saterate masatiri alien nama matsarati Good